terms of age, I've been instructed by Shubin, Comrade Shubin, to start the ball rolling. But I must say, it's not going to be easy after listening to historians and experts in their own right describing some of the issues that we went through during the liberation struggle and reading some of the history books which are supposed to be reflecting on our liberation struggles. I am going to give a picture of what, as an individual, I experienced and what I know. I'm happy that I don't have to say much because after Jocelyn and Joanne gave their own experience and the discussions that they had during their research of the liberation movements, they have collected quite a lot and they've said some of the things quite accurately, I must say. I'm also happy that somebody raised the issue of the Cold War that was in existence at the period. This is ZAPU having been formed a few years earlier than 1963, actually formed in 1962, after the NDP, which had been banned in 1961, and ZAPU is formed, and you are looking at young people that have come out of college, come out of secondary schools with their Cambridge or matriculation certificates, and they are angry young people. They have no choice of furthering their studies. If they can't get to university, and there's only one university in the whole of Rhodesia, and in order to get there, you must have excelled in your marks. There are no other tertiary institutions. Those that are there discriminate between whites and blacks. Virtually no blacks attend the agricultural colleges that are training there, except the ones that are lower, that are training more or less a field officer in agriculture rather than training, giving the actual training that is required for agricultural experts. And it is that period. We have had the 1961 constitutional talks in Rhodesia with Ian Smith, and they've dashed our hopes. Those talks are being held under a British plan, which is scheduled, deliberately scheduled, that we should not get independence until after 20 years. And you have a qualified franchise being introduced, and we're going to go through 20 years of improving that franchise until we have majority rule in 20 years. Meanwhile, there is the wind of change blowing from the north. Ghana has become independent, and a number of other countries are almost at the verge of getting their independence. Naturally, we are impatient, and we say to the leadership, we don't think there is any more time for discussing with the Smith regime. We want to trade. We want to take up arms and fight. And we volunteer to go for training. Prior to that, we have staged acts of resistance. We've used petrol bombs to bomb targets which we think are signs of government oppression. And we've done all those things, but some of us end up being arrested and being thrown into prison. So we are a frustrated lot of young people. The only job you could look at as going to be a policeman, joining the army, and a few other areas, a teacher, and a few other areas that were open where you could probably get employment. The lucky ones had proceeded to get jobs as clerks in certain organizations. For instance, we were the first blacks, I was amongst the first blacks to be taken in by Barclays Black as a bank clerk. And that was all that we could hope for. There was not much else. We didn't have any much choice but to be in that category. And we are asked to volunteer those who want to go for training. After the 1961 thing had failed, everybody saying, let's go to war. The only language the Smith regime will understand is fighting them. It is the barrel of the gun that will show him that we are serious about the demands for majority rule. And again, I'm amongst the first group of these volunteers who were divided into small sectors, and we are sent to a country that is called the Soviet Union. We've flown from Dar es Salaam through Khartoum with that very hot weather which we had never experienced in our lives. And you get out of the plane and you feel like you've been hit by a bomb. And from there we've flown, fortunately, into, this was September, in Moscow, and it's starting getting warmer. But you know, the weather there, you can never trust it. It's still cold. We get there, that year it was a winter which had extended, and it was pretty cold. And we get there, and the Russians were very excited about our arrival. They meet us and give us warm clothing. They're very anxious to make sure that we don't catch any cold. we get there, we taken to our training place, and again, at the training center, we met by very hospitable people. It was mainly Russian women who were responsible for our accommodation and for cooking for us. So they provided us all the meals that were required. Very exciting indeed, and we then taken to medical examinations. First time in our lives, we are going through what is called a medical examination, from head to foot to toe. We get thorough medical examinations to determine our state of health. Immediately after that, our training begins. We introduced to our course. In our case, it was military intelligence. And we given the whole range of subjects that we're going to do under that, from basic military combat training. Then we're also going to have some political lessons on socialism. And we're also going to have lessons on the history of the Soviet Union. The training course was very exciting. Our first course lasted about 8 months. And we went through that severe winter during our course of training, but we managed to survive. We did most of our theoretical training during the winter. We started off with the basic military training, whilst it was still a bit warm, combat training, etc. And then after that, concentrated on the theories. On the political lessons, Russia at the time was led by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And they tried to show us exactly how communism was going to be progressive and how at the end of the day it would survive above capitalism. I must say, from my own point of view, we had lots of discussions, lots of arguments, and we did not think really that what they were talking about could easily be attainable. Reaching the final stage of communism was certainly going to be a tall order. But nevertheless, there were areas in their socialist training which were akin to our own way of living, the African communities, the sharing of resources, such that you make sure that within that community, everybody is assisted. Everyone in the community has something to eat. they have a roof above their head. And those were very persuasive elements of socialism, which we appreciated. We did our guerrilla training. Also very fascinating, the change of training when we're doing guerrilla training. We had at a certain stage, 1963, when Katanga had been able to stop its war with a number of weaponry which came into Zambia and which we managed to smuggle into Zimbabwe. And I remember our group in Bulawayo, we got hold of some grenades and somebody had managed to bargain for these grenades with the Congolese in the Copperbelt that sold him quite a suitcase full of those grenades. And we're told exactly how very destructive they can be. And I remember how we took those grenades and threw them at targets. Nothing happened, they did not explode. The screw was still on, there was no primer, and we didn't know about that. And only when we got to the Soviet Union did we get to know that that hand grenade without a primer is almost like a stone. You throw it at anything, it will just hit there and nothing else. So they were very exciting experiences that we got. We then went on to the intelligence side, where we did our counterintelligence, where we concentrated on our efforts in order to prevent hostile organizations from gathering intelligence against our own organization, so that we could nip any of their plans against us before they materialized. Particularly focused on knowing our enemies, what resources they had, and also getting to know everything about them. The main purpose of this training was to produce a group of men who would be the vanguard of a guerrilla army, well-trained, self-sufficient, with no troop backup at the rear. These groups, as we planned, would then go inside the country, inside Rhodesia, train intelligence and small guerrilla units to lay the groundwork for larger platoon size units. And as the struggle progressed, even to be able to lay the groundwork for our regular units. After we completed this training, before I go to that, whilst in the Soviet Union, during training, we had a few breaks after each sector of study that were completed. We'll be taken on to go and visit a number of places. Most of our visits were around Moscow. First time to go to a ballet dance, we went to the Moscow theater, and still remember the show, what was the name? That famous ballet.
Swan Lake.
Yes, Swan Lake. And it was our first time to appreciate ballet dancing. We also went to a number of cultural events in Moscow. But also the most exciting visits that we made were the visits that we made to the cooperative farms, where we met old stalwarts, communist stalwarts. Were very happy to receive us. They didn't see the color of our skin at all. And we were given very good food. The old women argued when we came to discussing and were asking them questions about how they organized this and that. At the end of it, we offered, look, why worry about Smith? He's a madman. From the stories that you have told us about him, that person is not whole there. Forget about him. Here are beautiful girls. Stay here and marry. Until Smith gets tired. You will die one day. Then you can go back to your country. So those were some of the lighter moments of our training and discussions that we had. Nevertheless, in 1964, when we returned to Zambia, we were then asked by the leadership to form a command structure of a ZAPU military wing. We did not have, were the first ones to train. We then met with groups that had gone to train in Cuba, that had gone to train in China, in North Korea, in Egypt. I think those were the main countries that had accepted our first groups of training. We also had additional groups that had gone to other places in the Soviet Union, in the Ukraine. Whilst we were training around Moscow, there was groups that were training in the Ukraine. We then set about in 1964 on the instruction by the leadership to form the first military wing of ZAPU. You can imagine people coming from all those training backgrounds and getting together. We have to establish the military structure. And after having established that military structure, we must plan operations and start operations. The first task was to form that military structure. And with the different concepts from these other places of training. The debates were very scattered. There were times when it got so heated that we almost resorted to exchanging blows. But nevertheless, at the end we managed to come out with a compromise structure which we all agreed on. Once we had to agree on We had agreed on the structure. Next thing was to go back to the leadership and say, we now have this structure, but we can't go beyond that. You now must be able to appoint. And appoint the command people into that command structure. And we got people that were appointed. It wasn't a big structure to begin with. I think it was about 10 of us. I became the chief of intelligence, military intelligence, of course, responsible for reconnaissance along the whole border between Zimbabwe and Zambia, and straight further into Botswana. We then planned our operations, how we start our operations. This was towards the end, beginning of 65 and 64, beginning 65. And as I said, the idea was to send in small groups to begin with, individuals trained in intelligence who would get inside the country in order to set up contacts, the necessary contacts, where our first guerrilla units would go to. And once these were established, the next thing was to infiltrate those small guerrilla units who would go into the country with a view to training other younger people inside the country. We had casualties, both areas in until some of the intelligence people that we sent were identified by the Rhodesian security and thrown into prisons, in as much as some of the guerrilla units that we sent also had premature clashes, which resulted in casualties, and some of them being captured and also sent to prison thereafter. Whilst in 1966 we were busy looking at how best we should be able to progress as more groups came in to train, and they were graduating and coming in. We had to accommodate them and make sure that by the time they came into the country, we had plans that were ready to deploy them into the country under various strategies. Whilst we were doing this in 1966, we got the ANC, MK, Mkhonto Wesizwe, that's the military wing of the ANC, approaching us and saying, look, we have had a disastrous start. We've been trying to send, infiltrate our cadres through Botswana, and each time we infiltrate them, they are intercepted by the Botswana security, and we've told them they must surrender, they mustn't fight the Botswana security. And they always end up in prison, serve sentences, and then they're deported back to Zambia. So it's we're going nowhere. That's when we talked about the alliance, the so-called Wanke and the Spolilo battles that you've heard about came out as a result of that alliance that we talked about. Again, it wasn't easy. We're not ready. And we're talking about big numbers. We had been concentrating on small numbers of guerrilla units. But when our ANC MK comrades approached us. The plan was to infiltrate bigger units. Their argument was, look, we are not going to sacrifice our guys to go to Pretoria anymore. We are aware that the South African security are already in Rhodesia, and they are patrolling there. They've joined in patrolling since you people started the operations. They've decided to bring in their men there, and they're patrolling that border together with the Rhodesians in order to make sure that they gain experience and make sure that they intercept us at that early stage before we get to the Limpopo. And therefore, if you are going to say no to our proposal, we will go alone. We'll go through Rhodesia, because we know we'll be fighting both the Rhodesians and the South Africans. Finally, we found ourselves with no alternative but to compromise and agree to start those operations together with them. Our relations with the Soviet Union were very close. They remained our consultants throughout. We had a number of our young people who also went to train in the Soviet Union on the academic areas. Doctors, economists, accountants, whatnot, all produced in readiness for the time we would be victorious, and so that we have people that can be able to run the country that are knowledgeable. As I say, our relations expanded. I personally went back to the Soviet Union almost every year for refresher courses, as well as for consultations. In 1978, when we embarked on a very ambitious strategy, which we named the Turning Point, and this strategy was going to involve regular units with trained battalions. By the way, in the Soviet Union, in the later years, I think from the 70s, we only sent for training in the Soviet Union people who were specializing in artillery and in anti-air defense systems, etc. And that was the time we had also been able to train our MiG pilots. And the strategy of the Turning Point was going to involve us sending our battalions simultaneously across the Zambezi into Rhodesia. And they were going to defend their territory. Already at that stage, we had semi-liberated areas in the north of the country. The areas immediately after the Zambezi, most of them in the north were places like in this Polilo area, which is now Mashonaland, Central and Mashonaland West, with areas there which were almost semi-liberated. And similarly in the Bokwe area, in the Ngai areas, right down to the areas towards the Wanke National Game Park. Those were areas that had become almost no-go areas for the Rhodesian forces. And we're going to send our battalion unit that would go in and be able to occupy these liberated areas with the support of the people, the communities in those areas, such that the guerrilla units will then proceed into the hinterland and be able to cause more problems for the Rhodesian forces. And as we planned and started to execute this strategy, we had the Russian experts and the Cuban experts advising us. They were right here in Lusaka. We were ready. We had by then got hold of sophisticated crossing materials. Instead of wading across the Zambezi using small boats, we're going to be using amphibious equipment and putting up bridges in other areas. So we needed that expertise, and we had people that had trained. We had Russian advisors and Cuban advisors. And we had a lot of hope in what we're doing. Even during I'd left it out during the Lancaster House talks. Jocelyn did say, throughout our liberation struggle, we consulted very closely with our counterparts, our experts in the Soviet Union, and they lended all the support that we needed. It was a cold war, as somebody said, and obviously this was the last part of this was the subcontinent of Africa, and the Russians wanted to make sure that they also do have a foothold in that subcontinent. The Western countries did everything to prevent that. That was the scenario through which we went, and I'm told my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you for that really rich, wonderful presentation with the traces of personal stories of the sort as well. I'll comment on things at the end. Right now, let's just try to jump into the next presentation. Vladimir.
With your permission, you see, because I'm not too well.
You'd rather.
I will sit.
That's absolutely fine.
Oh, they put some skills and that's part of the skill.
That's absolutely
6 or 8,
That's absolutely fine.
So first of all, it's very difficult for me to speak after my old friend and comrade Dumiso Dabengwa. First, he explained already most of the points which concern the Soviet involvement in the region and the South Africa in particular, Southern Africa and Zimbabwe in particular. I will try maybe to elaborate some of the points, and then if you don't mind, I deliberately didn't ask questions during the previous presentations, and I will comment on some of them, maybe. So, the Cold War, I'm a bit skeptical about the whole idea of Cold Wars. The point is, of course it existed, but we never call it Cold Wars. We call it anti-imperialist struggle, which was supposed to be waged by the socialist countries, liberation movements, and so-called working class and capitalist countries. As naive as it may sound now, that was the approach. And in any case, we should not underestimate the local dynamics. A simple example, there is no Cold War, or at least they say there is no Cold War, but the struggle in Palestine continues. Just one of the examples. This is point number one. Point number two about Soviet involvement. There was no any geopolitical projects. Some people criticize my articles or books, say, but why he doesn't show real intentions, but how can I show something which didn't exist? It was mostly reactive, maybe not active enough, mostly reactive policy. The direct sense of the word reactive to the requests of the relevant liberation movements. In case of Zimbabwe, what Comrade Dumiso was saying now, perhaps one point I have to mention, of course not in my business, a very serious blow on ZAPU was that split in the early 70s when Chikirima and Nyandoro practically they left for Foliz in a couple of days. But that was a serious block to the development of the struggle, including armed struggle, and I think it had consequences, some negative consequences, all along the 70s. And here again, the Soviet position was very careful, you see. We always called for unity, and the same applies to our attitude to the patriotic front, even to GMC, the Joint Military Command Building. Maybe we done it too much, in the sense that we sacrificed our relations with ZANU. There were some contacts, you see. Sorry, Chitepa was drinking my beer in Oslo in 1973, during one of the international conferences. But when I mentioned to him, or hinted to him, that maybe the GMC can send somebody in Moscow, he insisted it should be separate. Anyhow, that's another story, as they say. Now, that was a problem, but I will partially speak about it maybe more when I will deliver the report later. And here, perhaps some words about the mechanism. How did Soviet Union operate as far as the liberation struggle is concerned? You see, there were state organizations and there were non-state organizations, not anti-state, but non-state, not anti-government, but not governmental, what we call in Russia, общественные, which is difficult to translate, something like social organizations. And the most active in that sense was the Soviet Operation Solidarity Committee. I happened to be secretary there for 7 years in the 70s for Africa. And that was it was not government organization. Even financially, the money was coming from the Soviet peace fund. It was not controlled by government, it was controlled by the ruling party, of course. There is the old man, Professor Ulyanovsky, who was deputy head of the department, international department, once told, I think it was Comrade Shubin and Dabengwa, if my memory serves me well, the committee is the extension of the international department operations. So the messages would come, or delegations would come, then they would write to the Central Committee. Central Committee will issue the decision, instruction to the ministries, various ministries, usually it's defense, trade, defense industry, etc., State Committee for Foreign Economic Relations. and say to prepare, usually in 1 month's time, the proper draft decision of the government, because of course it was later officially endorsed by the decision of the government. I remember in some cases after the personal common visit, was even put 2 weeks, not 1 month, but the situation was urgent, you see. What kind of assistance? Of course, training of the personnel, which Dabengwa explained now. True, there were maybe 2-3 types of training. First, it started in the Crimea mostly, in the case of South Africa and Odessa, even early, semi-guerrilla, a bit of regular, but mostly guerrilla. And then, of course, what the people of this region used to call Northern Training Center, that Moscow and around, that's the most sophisticated. My counterpart was there. And with the, how to say, broadening of the struggle, it was becoming more and more sophisticated, so more people were trained in different, more regular military units. And as it was mentioned already, many of people, hundreds passed also through the academic training. It should not be forgotten. You see, a bit couple maybe of the lighter words. I happened to be present at the Unity Congress in December '89 in Harare, when the unity between ZANU and ZAPU was finalized. 87. No, 87 is previous, but the Congress 89.
Okay.
The Congress, 87 agreement. So then we were sitting at the lunch, what do you call it? Near somebody's house, you see. And then the Zimbabwe, mostly our graduates were, started saying, следующая остановка улица 1905 года. Осторожно, двери закрываются. That's the words in the metro, you see, in underground. Next station, street so-and-so. 1905, of course, was the first Russian Revolution. Take care, the doors will be closed. And I was surprised why this were in their point. And Chingadubi, who was the second honorable Chingadubi, he was elected a month or 2 ago to Parliament, to National Assembly. He was the head of the union in Moscow, in Soviet. He said, Shubin, you forgot, I lived in the hostel the next day, so I used to call people, students to come there. This is just human points. And of course, some other people also started in the youth school, in the something like party schools, Institute of Social Sciences. You can see it as a leadership courses. As far as our people are concerned, again, Dabengwa mentioned it already, there were 2 groups of our military involved. One was in Angola, in Boma, in the eastern part of the country. There were Cubans there, then our people joined also. And a small group in Zambia, Professor Solodovnikov, who was ambassador, he wrote about it before. It was read by a very good man, Colonel Kolanov. And you see, our problem, we think that we never die, you see. And our friends also are supposed to, we agreed to discuss, and then Solodovnikov told me and said that the left is no more dying, you see. That's the problem. The problem is the documents, many of them, as it was discussed today, still sealed. But even if the documents are available, as a historian, I'm absolutely sure there should be a combination of oral history and the documents. Because some documents, if you see, say, transcription of discussion by 2 different types, sides, they will be different as a rule. And unfortunately, we are losing people, and we are not careful enough to take their memories. As it was mentioned today, something by Professor Santa, something has been done as far as our people in Angola are concerned. And one article also by General Budenko, General Budenko, who used to be captain there in Boma. But it's not enough. And you know, the people are scattered all over the former Soviet Union in different countries now. So we are trying to do something, but it's very difficult, speaking as a historian, very difficult to get a proper picture. Our archives, as Natalia mentioned today, it's a very complicated issue. The problem is that our people in the archives, what do you call it in English, they don't sanitize it. You know, you take the American papers, most of them are available, but often they're sanitized. You can see maybe one line or two lines on the page. And see, because there are people not doing it, they're withholding the information. But on the other side, people are a bit lazy to how to say, to dig at the archives. You know, recently, maybe I'm going a bit aside, but recently there was a big noise when the late now, unfortunately, Professor Stephen Ellis was trying to prove that Nelson Mandela was in the Communist Party. But it's available in the Russian archives. One of my PhD candidates, under my advice, found in the 2000, year 2000, 15 years ago, the document is there. I just agreed with him not to open it until he is no more, you see. But it's available in the archives, you see. But people don't know that, they don't know why. They go, but not always find it. You also must know where to find it. That's another story. Anyhow, that's the problem. They're starting opening, but in a very, very slow way, and some documents maybe, especially of the later period of 91, may be lost, because don't forget we had a very serious problems in our country in 1991, which directly concerned some documents as well. Now, with your permission, I would say a few words about the developments, about some comments on what was discussed here before. About Frelimo, relations with Frelimo, I think the paper was good, but let's not forget the question was not only Eduardo Mondlane and background. There were two more points. When they agreed to form Frelimo, they decided that no former leader of the previous organizations, Udinamo, MAN, etc., comes to the leadership now. And that, of course, they were not very happy. Therefore, they were always complaining, saying that he's American man, this and that. And the other side, he also made some mistake. How they pronounce it? Portuguese, Milas or Milas, that guy who was there responsible for Milas, yeah? Who was responsible, who happened not to be Mozambican finally, and Mondlane kept him as the head of propaganda information, call it as you like. So that was the situation at that stage. About UNITA, I like the title, of course, from world to matter, but maybe it's also from matter to the world. Because, you know, it was announced, this split with Holta Roberta was announced by Savimbi in Cairo. Practically, UNITA was cooked in Sweden. Then they went to China before real operations inside Angola. Or at least, if to be more serious, I think it was bilateral movement. And by the way, now when South African former, they call it RICI, how they call it, these former special units, they're also veterans, they had many unions, they started speaking, they confessed that a number of operations which were attributed to UNITA were performed by them. For example, they shut down one, I think it was Antonov, one of our transport planes there. Now they say, yes, we were there, we done it, but we had a company of UNITA accompanying us, you see. Because they, remember that scandal when one was captured in Cabinda, but there are many stories of that. So degree of dependence is a serious question which needs, of course, additional study, you see. Katanga, also kind of joke, you see, one of our veterans, interpreter guy who was there in Angola told me how they had some meetings with Angolans, our ambassador, and there was some African fellow, the ambassador was running away from him. And later I understood that was exactly the leader of Katangese. So they tried to implicate us in some way, but not always maybe succeeded. Other mission book, please, those who are dealing with South Africa, read it. I was happy to hear Professor Santos, it's already available in the internet, in English. It's a kind of rejoinder to Crocker book, you know, that Hainu in the Southern Africa. It was reading. And here that special case, of course, which was mentioned also today, about reduction of UNTAG. You know, this United Nations Transitional Assistance Group. What was wrong? Sorry, now we'll be a bit political. As you know, we had this thing called perestroika under Gorbachev. And because the results were a disaster, some people dismiss it completely. I personally believe there were two stages. First stage very positive, second stage very negative, when the slogans were more socialism, more democracy, but it became more capitalism and less democracy, because practically Politburo even was not working, and Secretariat was closed for a year of the party, and very often Shevardnadze and Gorbachev would take decisions just between themselves. Even such critical decision on the GDR, you know, dissolution, this and that was taken behind the back, for example, of the International Secretary of the party. But as far as UNTAG is concerned, it was Shevardnadze's decision. There was no any decision made in Moscow. Technically they were right. It was nothing wrong in cutting those, I don't remember how, 7,000 or 5,000 UN troops were supposed to be there. But it was done behind the back of ZAPU and behind the back of Cubans. The Cubans heard from Americans about it. Sam Nuyom, I think he was in Harare when he heard about it. That was very wrong. And the very fact that ZAPU was not involved enough at the last stage of talks, you see. And I think it had detrimental consequences, including the 1st of April 1989. Of course, it was not one much was there in Windhoek on the 25th anniversary inauguration. President Geingob on his invitation, and of course Martti Ahtisaari was there. You remember that former president of Finland, who was at that stage representative, United Nations Secretary General in Windhoek. But I was not very happy to see him, because he is responsible for hundreds of people, persons killed on the 1st of April or later, when he allowed the South African troops to leave their base at Kufut and start massacres of the people. He did not even report to United Nations in a proper way to New York, because the Deputy Secretary General of UN was Vasily Safranchuk, late Soviet ambassador diplomat, and he wrote later that he didn't report. He was responsible, he was supposed to report, but he didn't do it. And the last point, maybe the very last point, you see, I don't know what way it can be organized, but really the history of Southern Africa, of the resistance, needs more, maybe through the magazines, maybe through the conferences, maybe nowadays through the Skype conferences, easy conference. But as historian, I would want to say that we still have a lot to do. Thank you. Sorry for taking much of the time.
Yeah, thank you both for really wonderful presentations. The sense of view from both sides, those who are receiving the assistance, those who are giving the assistance. Yeah, on Dr. Dabengwa's side, just one thing that I found refreshing is this sense of when you talk about starting out the struggle, the notion of the strong militancy that you have, that we only need your freedom to come out of the barrel of a gun. I found quite refreshing, because most of my subjects are Azan folks. One of the things they always like to say is that ZIMPRA was never about fighting. And it's really refreshing. Yeah. And also, at the beginning, your point about being finding quite accurate the discussions that went on before, and that also comforting, so to speak. To have you in front row and we're all talking about the histories that you probably know, obviously know more intimately than we do, but it was good to hear that we're somewhat on the right track. And then Professor Shubin, yes, for blowing some holes in some of the representations of the call for the notions of the geopolitical design. That was interesting. But also the value of oral history. As you say, we shouldn't cry about the archives not being available. We should get to all the living people get their accounts. We can get into the archives much later. Okay, that's all I'll say about that. But I'll just quickly say something else. There's no Zanla individual here, but I do have a transcript of one David Tondala with me. He was in ZIMPRA first and Zanla second. And I'll just read to you a bit where I talked to him about his experiences of training abroad and so on. In ZIMPRA, he went to Russia. This was in 1968. But when he joined Zanla, he also goes to Bulgaria. And the Bulgaria bit, he says this, I'm reading it now. We were in a military camp and secluded from the community. We were not allowed to mix with the locals. We were told that you were here for military training, so you do that only. We were told that if we went around, we might be a security risk. The trainers were fair. There was no racism. So there's not much to say about the Bulgarian experience besides training day in, day out. Then when he now begins to speak about this in Bulgaria, this experience with Zanla, with ZIMPRA now, the Soviet Union, when he went in 1968, he says the Soviet Union was different. We were allowed to go out from time to time and drink. It sort of fits with the name was
That's the most important.
Yeah. The Russians even gave us small stipends, unlike the Bulgarians. I did not encounter any racism at all in Russia. There was no indication of racism. We had an interpreter called Mr. Anatolia. He was a huge man. And in Russia, we were taken to a cooperative where I began challenging the foundations for this cooperative. And the person managing it said to Mr. Anatolia that this one is very opinionated, too talkative. About 6 months later or so, the Russians expelled me. They sent me home. This is the same David Tondala who also gets expelled from the Zanla, so quite a history. But anyway, it's just interesting to see the differences.
But any reason for to be expelled?
He says like he was too opinionated. That's what he said. But I just thought I would, because it's
What year? What year?
This is 1968. So this is a teaser of ZAPU, but very quickly. Okay, now I want to open it up to the floor. Questions, and I'll take 3 at a time. Marcus.
Thank you very much to both speakers. I have a question for Mr. Dabengwa, if I can. I wanted to ask about your relations with the Zambian state in this first period of establishing military operations. We know that at a political level, relations between the ZAPU leadership and the Zambian government were cordial and strong. But I just wanted to ask about Zambia did face a dilemma, as you know, of course, of hosting a military movement on its soil. And I wanted to ask about whether you had relations with Zambian armed forces and to some extent with the Zambian population. You know, did you experience problems or challenges in conducting a military operation at a time in the mid-1960s when Zambia was publicly, at least, denying that an armed struggle was underway, at least on a sort of public level. I just wanted to get a sense of your own experience of that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to address my question to Dr. Dabengwa. But first of all, let me salute you, sir. And this is because just last week when I was preparing my paper, which I presented already, I was reading a book by Hugh Macmillan on the Lusaka years of the ANC.
A good book, by the way.
Yeah, very, very good book. And I was reading about the early movement, and I read about you and the alliance with Umkhonto weSizwe and the Wanki and the Sipolilo campaigns, which you have referred to. And you know how they went, and how, according to Hugh Macmillan, which I think you hinted at, perhaps the group wasn't so prepared at that time for that kind of situation. Perhaps the intelligence wasn't enough, adequate information. but it was a problem, and also there is a reference to some misunderstandings between the Zimbabwean group and the South Africans Umkhonto weSizwe in terms of strategy sometimes. For example, the capsizing of a raft, which according to Hugh Macmillan was carrying arms, supposed from the Zambian side to the Zimbabwean side, and capsized with about 45,000 rounds of ammunition and so on. And that, if I remember well, it was you and others from the South African side who were arguing as whether all the weapons should go at one time or not. So I wanted you to comment about that, the alliance with Umkhonto weSizwe. But also for you, maybe at a personal level, because I read that and I was also touched that there was a lot of sacrifice when there was the crossing across the Zambezi and then encountering those unexpected clashes and so many people dying. How did you survive it, sir? And how did you feel to see comrades that you trained with die?
But then one preferably for Shubin.
In Zambia, to start off with, Zambia used to deny that ZIMPRA forces were operating in its territory. Yes, it was all quiet. The Zambian army saw us with one eye, the other one was always closed, and no reports were made. Even the national parks people along the river, when they saw us, they chose to go the other way and not make contact with us, because they've been told they must ignore the fact that we exist and go the other way. But as time went on, and it became clear that we were operating on Zambian soil, at that time we had established relations with the Zambian army, and we met, and we had started even training camps in Zambia. I did say that at a later stage, the only people that went to the Soviet Union were people who were going for specialized training in artillery, etc. But the basic military training was done here, and only those that were to be sent for advanced training would go to the Soviet Union, whilst the other ones were infiltrated into the country. So we're training camps in Zambia, in Angola, and in Tanzania. And the Zambians got to know about it. We discussed with the army. They would advise on some of the intelligence that they had gathered about the movement of Rhodesians, because the Rhodesians apparently had infiltrated quite a lot of informers. There were quite a number of Rhodesians who actually settled in Zambia, and some of them became targets for training, were using as informers by the Rhodesians. So that was the situation. And but we had good relations with the Zambian army. There came a time when, as I say, 78, 79, when we started getting this sophisticated equipment, more sophisticated even than what the Zambians had. And this is what I said led Margaret Thatcher when she was told by KK that if you don't find a solution to the Rhodesian issue, I'm afraid this whole region is going to be involved in a asked Kaunda why he did not make an effort to cut our ZIMPRA forces down. He says, what are you talking about? They're stronger than the Zambian army. How do you expect me to do that? They will drive me out, out of office. So eventually we really had good relations with Zambia. They understood us. On the issue of what he wrote, I must also say that I've read the book and I think it is a very almost accurate picture of what the situation was, at least for controversies for the ANC during the time I was in Zambia, from what I know. And he does bring this about, that when we did plan the operations with MK, there were quite a number of arguments. Yes, there were quite a number of arguments, naturally. We had only been 2 years as a military wing of ZAPU. We're not even ZIMPRA then. We just were known as the military wing of ZAPU. And we hardly had any experiences. I've said that we sent in intelligence people inside, we sent small guerrilla units that got intercepted after a few months of stay in the country, and the record was not very good. And we were hesitant in getting involved in a huge movement of personnel, both ZIMPRA and ANC. We're putting two of our platoons, which is about 60 men, plus a platoon of Umkhonto Wesizwe, which was 30, 90 men being crossed at one time into Zimbabwe, as against the small units of maximum 8-10 people that we used, that were being used to cross it. So we were very cautious. But on the other hand, as I said, when they insisted, if we did not say yes, they would go ahead on their own. And that to us would be unacceptable. Having MK fighting our war inside Rhodesia. And we ultimately had to come to a compromise. The issue of the boat that capsized, this was next to the Chihore River on the Zimbabwean side, Manapul's area, where the Spolilo operations took off from. The commander of MK, Joe Modise, suggested that instead of using the small little boats carrying the weapons across, he then designed a pontoon, which was made out of the 44-gallon drums, tied on rafts, and then we had lots of weapons that were placed there. Some very heavy weapons, machine guns. We even put in some donkeys that were going to carry these materials when across there. And we thought, instead of just letting it go on its own, we should have a rope tied to a tree on the Rhodesian side and another long rope remaining on the Zambian side, also tied to a tree, so that we would be feeding it into the water slowly. But hardly did we realize that right in the middle of the water, of the river, the water is almost circulating And when it got there, the whole thing just went off. It was an accident.
Poor donkeys.
The poor donkeys were drowned, and we couldn't rescue them. One of them that managed to swim went across, but it was eaten by a lion immediately. So that was the disaster of the operation. But after that, we picked up, we used the small boats and managed to cross. We worked one day across, as we had decided. And in actual fact, to make the units that were crossing more confident, we accompanied them inside Rhodesia, and we stayed there. Went together with John Motise, with about 6 others, or about 8 of us. And we stayed there, remained in the country in Zimbabwe for almost 10 days. And it was only the commanders of the unit who said, no, you better go back. You are confusing our plans of how we should be operating, because every day you are asking for details of what we're going to be doing. So you go back to Lusaka. That's when we retreated back.
Last one question.
Yes, but sorry, but I wanted to
No, I have to give others a chance.
There's a part you didn't answer.
Okay. I found the presentations incredibly moving, and I like particularly the way both speakers were encouraged to talk quite personally. So I hope you'll indulge me for a minute as I discuss a very personal connection to this story, but in the broader sense. During the period of perestroika and glasnost, in the early 1990s, I was with my grandfather in Canada. He was a leading member of the Manitoban Communist Party. He described the imminent collapse of the Soviet Union as being like the death of a child. His life had been spent as a political activist in the organization. He'd seen it as really the promised land. I was wondering whether both of you could comment on your own experiences of the collapse of the Soviet Union, how it felt personally, but also perhaps more broadly what it's forced you to do politically in terms of your understanding of liberation movements, the role of socialism, and those possibilities today.
Second one.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah. Congratulations, you're obviously very brave men and women. But you did say that, Comrade Dabengwa, that you also got theoretical training. So I want to know what was the theory of the revolution? As you know that, in some countries you had, a form of bourgeois nationalism, almost two-stage theory. But I see with others like Frelimo, they were wanting socialism now. So I just want to know, and also how, maybe also Comrade Shubin can answer that one. What was the attitude to competing socialist tendencies, let's say Trotskyism, within this, strategic political framework? Thank you.
My question to Professor Shubin, a very quick one. So we've heard a lot about the experience of the ZAPU members who went for military training in the Soviet Union. So can you say that the experience of others who went and the attitudes towards them from the Soviets was the same? So can you generalize from this example we heard about experience of the Zimbabweans to the others, liberation of second feeling, who also went for training?
Thank you. Right now, we have the tea break coming up, so we can ask some questions. Shubin first.
Yeah, okay, thank you. To collapse, it will take us a couple of hours at least. I will repeat one story which I'm sorry some of you have already heard before. I was the last Russian, maybe the last European to see Vladimir Julius Maria against his village. It's another story, I'm ready to comment later, privately. But then his manager was coming out of house to say goodbye, and I heard that he was former chair of cooperative during Nyerere days. I asked him, please, Ndugu, tell me why this very cooperative collapsed. And he said it did not collapse, it was collapsed. So that's my answer. Is personal details I can tell you later. And Natalia, if I understood it correctly, I mean the comparison between different groups.
Yeah,
Look, it depends, of course, on education, to a large extent. To the best of my knowledge, Zimbabweans were one of the best. As you know, the education was not bad in Rhodesia. I mean, school education, plus knowledge of English. Because, you know, for example, in some other groups, you have to have double translation from vernacular to, say, Portuguese, and then to Russian, which was, of course, much more complicated. And I was not involved seriously, apart from some discussions and the general stuff with military training at that stage. But as far as civilians are concerned, the students were good, the discipline was good, the level was good, much better than some others.
First, the political training. It was not political training. When I talked about the theory of socialism, this was really merely to be able to explain to us. We're not taking it as a lesson as such, but it was politics, discussions, getting to know how the Soviet Union was able to have its victory. And we're motivated by the feelings that we saw from time to time of how the Soviet people went through these struggles, particularly the Second World War. And that motivated us, that made us feel good and determined to come back home and be able to do exactly the same, if not better. So it wasn't training, it was discussions, and we were allowed to ask questions, we were allowed to argue, and we came out clearly, some of us, and said, we don't see you succeeding in achieving absolute communism, like you say. But as I said, there were some very good aspects during those discussions. As far as the collapse of the Soviet Union is concerned, I must say that I was privileged enough, at least, to be prepared for it. When I passed through Moscow on my way to the Lancaster House talks in 1979, and the colleagues that I met, I don't know if Putin was still young
Putin was maybe lieutenant,
but these senior officers that I met of the KGB did hint that there were going to be some changes coming. And you people must negotiate seriously with the changes that are going to affect us. We might not be able to continue giving you the sort of support that we've been giving you. So that hint, although I did not understand it clearly what it was, but it almost prepared me to accepting that yes, this is possibly what they were talking about when I heard about it.
Okay, round of applause for two excellent presentations.